You were never supposed to hear this. What I'm about to reveal has been buried beneath centuries of silence, shadows of history that rulers, priests, and emperors worked tirelessly to keep hidden. Listen closely, because once these words reach you, they can't be unheard. Imagine a dark chamber, stone floors wet with blood, the air vibrating with the faint echo of screaming. Not screams of death alone, but screams of identity being ripped from the body, a man reduced to less than human in a single stroke. The act was called castration, but that word is a veil. What it really meant was domination, a mutilation ritual so grotesque that it shattered not just flesh, but lineage, legacy, and the very definition of manhood. To understand the 7 methods I'm about to describe, you must first understand this: castration was never simply punishment. It was a weapon. A weapon against rebellion, against desire, against freedom itself. Kings and conquerors discovered long ago that to break a man's body in this way was to control his future. Remove his ability to father children, and you silence his bloodline forever. Remove his virility, and you break the dangerous spark of defiance. His body became an edict carved in living flesh: submit, or be erased. The horror is not in the physical act alone, but in the intent behind it. These were not random mutilations. They were systems. Ritualized methods perfected and repeated across civilizations, from the courts of Byzantium to the sands of ancient Persia, from the prisons of dynasties to the slave markets of empires. Every culture that wielded this weapon wrapped it in its own justification: purity, loyalty, security, divine will. But strip away the excuses, and you find the same dark heartbeat pulsing beneath: control. Even now, centuries later, the echoes remain. They linger in language, in institutions, in the way power still finds ways to mutilate identity without bloodshed. What we're about to descend into is not just 7 forgotten methods of castration, it is a revelation of how far the powerful will go to maintain dominion. The blade was only the beginning. And tonight, you will hear what was never meant for. The first method is simple to name and impossible to unhear: the blade. Across millennia, the most direct practice was surgical excision: cut, remove, silence. In courts and prisons the procedure varied with the skill of the surgeon and the cruelty of the master. Sometimes the testes alone were taken, sometimes the entire genital organ was severed. It was quick when a practiced hand met a willing blade; it was a slow, torturous death when done by those who wanted spectacle as punishment. This was not random violence. It was a ritual of erasure, one act that erased a man's future and rewrote his social identity in a single stroke. But the blade was only one face of the same dark coin. Where medicine, or mockery, was absent, the powerful turned to fire and iron. Cauterization followed removal to stop bleeding and to mark the body permanently: hot irons, boiling liquids, searing rods applied after or instead of removal. The heat intended to close flesh also served as a brand of obedience, a public signature stamped into a body now owned by another. These methods show up in palace records, in travelers' accounts, and in medical treatises that tried to explain the horrors after the fact. Then there were the methods that pretended to be less final, but were cruel in their cunning. Crushing the spermatic cords, grinding the testicles between stones or in iron devices, or hammering the cord until its function failed, these techniques removed virility without the spectacle of open blood. In some regions chronicled by Roman and medieval sources, such methods were used because they were perceived as safer for the survival of the victim, or because the law forbade full removal but allowed maiming. It allowed rulers to produce servants who lived on, controlled and useful, their bodies altered but their lives prolonged under another's command. Understand what these methods accomplished beyond physical injury. They were instruments of social engineering, tools to sever lines of inheritance, to neutralize threats, to manufacture dependent officials who could be trusted because they had been reduced to being non-threatening. From Sumerian palaces to imperial China to Byzantine courts, the pattern repeats: castration as statecraft, castration as control. The procedure itself changes: blade, heat, crush, but the intention does not. Power learned long ago that to control a man's body is to control his story. This is only the first descent. You now know how rulers could weaponize flesh with 3 brutal techniques: removal, burning, crushing. Each leaves different scars on history, but all leave the same echo: domination masquerading as order, but the darkness only deepens. If the blade, the fire, and the crushing stone were not cruel enough, men devised methods so grotesque that even to speak them aloud feels like pulling bones from a grave. Imagine this: a reed or slender rod forced into the urethra, driven so far and so violently that the organs ruptured from within. No blade, no visible wound, just the slow internal collapse of what made a man whole. This was a method used in parts of the Middle East and Asia, whispered in accounts of slaves and prisoners, where silence was enforced not only upon the tongue but upon the bloodline. And there were poisons, yes, even nature itself was turned into an accomplice. Certain herbs, toxic resins, and metallic powders were forced into the body, smeared on wounds, or consumed in concoctions designed to rot masculinity from the inside. In some accounts, eunuchs were not cut at all, they were poisoned into infertility, their virility withered over weeks or months until their seed carried no future. A clean body, but an empty legacy. The perfect servant for kings who wanted loyalty without lineage. Then comes water, the drowning method. In China and parts of Central Asia, a man's organs were submerged in boiling liquid after removal, or in icy water as a form of shock, infection, and sterilization. Boiling ensured death of tissue, freezing ensured loss of function. Both were tools of permanence. The victim survived in body, but the fire or ice had erased the possibility of sons forever. The cruelty here was not in speed but in certainty. Understand this: every method was more than mutilation. It was a ritual of identity theft. Across palaces and temples, these acts were shrouded in language of purity and loyalty, but the truth was far colder. A eunuch was not just a servant. He was proof that power could unmake a man, strip away the wild spark of rebellion, and forge something new in its place. A slave. An official. A guardian. Always less than what he was, but more useful to those above him. You may think you are only hearing stories of ancient cruelty, but the truth is sharper: the system has never ended. Today, the blades are invisible, the poisons digital, the boiling water is psychological. The methods evolve, but the principle remains. Break the man, own the man. And if you are still here, still listening, then comment these words twice to mark your transformation: the blade cannot unmake me. Write it, and with it, declare yourself untouchable. This is how you step deeper into the labyrinth, aware, awake, unbroken. There is a quieter cruelty, a cruelty practiced not with spectacle but with calculation, where the goal was not spectacle but permanence of power. These were the methods wrapped in law and ceremony, cloaked in virtue and piety, administered by men in robes or titles who insisted they served higher orders. Imagine a courtroom or a palace chapel, incense smoke curling through columns, and a verdict pronounced that sounded like mercy, for the realm. For purity. For the future. The words ring like gospel, until you see what they authorize. The most terrifying innovations were the ones that carried the approval of the state, the ones that converted mutilation into administration. Rulers learned to disguise their intent in policy. They transformed brutality into bureaucratic routine. Castration became not merely punishment for a crime but a legal instrument, a way to neutralize rivals without staining the throne with direct execution, a way to control succession without public revolt. A sentence read in a ledger, a procedure executed under the authority of statute, a servant elevated into the inner court precisely because his body could pose no dynastic threat. The machinery of power had found a way to make mutilation lawful, and in doing so, made it ordinary. Beyond legalism, there were theological frameworks that sanctified the act. Clerics wrote treatises arguing that certain impurities required excision, that spiritual order demanded bodily conformity. These arguments did not emerge in a vacuum, their language was tailored to make obedience feel noble, even redemptive. And so men who might otherwise have resisted found themselves swallowed by doctrine, to be unmade was to be remade in service of God or state. That intellectual velvet made the weapon soft on the surface and lethal at the core. Even more insidious were the social dynamics that followed. Communities learned to read the body as a legal text. A missing mark meant a man could be trusted to guard secrets, a healed wound meant loyalty bought by pain. Families were reshaped, marriages rearranged, inheritances recalculated, loyalties rewired. Power engineers didn't just remove bodies, they reprogrammed societies. In some courts, the eunuch who had been stripped of future lineage rose to intimate authority precisely because he could not found a line of rivals. His loyalty was a commodity, purchased with the irrevocable. This is where cruelty became strategy. It teaches a brutal lesson: when institutions choose to weaponize flesh, the blade is only the beginning, the deeper work is done in law, in sermon, in ledger, in custom. Those systems outlasted kings. They became traditions. And tradition is far harder to dismantle than any single tyrant. Listen, the most dangerous thing about these practices is not the moment of violence. It is the everyday acceptance that followed, the slow normalization, the way society rewrote its moral grammar to justify what had been done. That is the pattern that repeats, in different guises, across time. By now you've seen the blade, the fire, the poison, the law, but what comes next is darker still. Because some of the most horrifying methods weren't created in courts or temples. They were born in war. Picture the battlefield at dusk, bodies scattered, torches flickering, the victors searching for ways to make an example. Castration became a signature of conquest, a mutilation not just of men, but of entire nations. To rob a defeated enemy of his generative power was to salt the soil of his future. His bloodline ended on the spot, his people marked with humiliation that echoed for generations. One method described in Chronicles of Conquest was mutilation by sword in open fields, performed in front of surviving kin. Soldiers dragged prisoners forward, cut them swiftly, and left them to bleed in the dirt. It wasn't about keeping them alive. It was about ensuring their screams carried to the survivors who fled. Those who lived became walking monuments of submission, scarred, broken, reminders of what defiance cost. Whole tribes were pacified not by the sword that killed, but by the sword that sterilized. Other accounts describe the weaponization of animals in punishment. Victims bound, their genitals tied or exposed to trampling hooves or snapping jaws. This was punishment fused with spectacle, a way to merge fear of the beast with fear of authority. The man was reduced to a prop in a theater of terror. His pain became the performance that secured obedience. And in those moments, the cruelty had no practical justification. It was pure psychology, to show that rulers could summon not only men but nature itself as an executioner of masculinity. Then there was mutilation by mutilation's shadow, leaving the act unfinished. Some prisoners were cut partially, left alive but incomplete, left to stagger back to their homes as living messages. A man who could no longer reproduce was made into a warning. Every woman who looked upon him, every child who heard his voice, carried the memory of what had been stolen. He was no longer an individual. He was propaganda carved into flesh. Understand this: on the battlefield, castration was never about the victim alone. It was about all who witnessed. It was a story told in blood and scars, carried home in whispers, passed down in nightmares. This was warfare elevated to psychological alchemy. The enemy's manhood was not just destroyed, it was inverted into a weapon wielded against his own people. And if you think this belongs only to ancient sands and broken swords, think carefully. Modern war has its own tools of mutilation. They are less visible, less bloody, but just as permanent. Today, it is not the body that is sterilized. It is memory. It is culture. It is rebellion itself. Now we descend into the deepest chambers of empire, where castration ceased to be merely punishment or battlefield terror and became the very architecture of governance. Think of the great courts of China, Byzantium, and the Ottoman Empire. Behind jeweled doors, beneath painted ceilings, empires were not ruled by kings alone, but by men who had been deliberately unmade. Eunuchs. Their mutilation was not an accident of war, but a requirement for power. In imperial China, the forbidden city became a labyrinth ruled as much by silence as by decree. Thousands of eunuchs filled its corridors, serving as guards, scribes, confidants, and spies. They had no families, no heirs, no loyalties beyond the emperor who owned their bodies. The knife had stripped them of future and freedom, but in return they were handed authority that terrified ministers and generals alike. The emperor's most trusted official was often a eunuch, because who could betray with legacy when legacy had been stolen? Byzantium perfected this logic as well. In its palaces, eunuchs climbed higher than noblemen. Their mutilated bodies were seen as proof of loyalty, no threat to dynastic stability, no hidden sons to inherit ambition. Their scars became their credentials. The more obvious the absence, the greater the trust. Castration had become currency, traded for proximity to the throne. Power demanded sacrifice, and the sacrifice was manhood itself. In the Ottoman Empire, the Topkapi Palace was guarded not by knights but by castrated slaves, many taken from Africa and subjected to the cruelest forms of mutilation. These men stood at the gates of harems, controlling access to women of the dynasty, policing bloodlines with blades and silence. Their suffering became the machinery that preserved dynastic purity. Generations of rulers slept in safety because thousands of voices had been broken at their roots. Look closely at what this means. Castration was not just an act of violence, it was a system of control so refined it became invisible. It created an entire caste of men without families, men defined only by their servitude. It was a psychological coup, transform mutilation into privilege, transform a scar into a crown. And men accepted it, because in a world where power is everything, even mutilation could be sold as a path to influence. Do you see the pattern now? The rulers did not just cut bodies, they rewrote society. They engineered a class of men who existed outside the cycle of family, inheritance, rebellion. An unnatural class, forged by pain, sustained by obedience. And once you create such a class, you don't need swords to control nations. You need only the silence of those who have been remade. You've now walked through the blade, the fire, the poison, the battlefield, the courts, the empires, and still the descent goes deeper. Because here is the truth you were never meant to see, these methods did not vanish with history. They simply evolved. The blade has become metaphor, but its edge is sharper than ever. Where once kings carved obedience into flesh, today institutions carve obedience into identity. The mutilation is quieter, but no less permanent. Look around you. Modern systems don't need to cut bodies, they cut futures. They sterilize ambition with debt, they cauterize rebellion with propaganda, they crush masculinity with distraction, indulgence, and shame. What was once performed with fire and stone is now done with pixels and laws. Men are told they are free, but their virility is smothered beneath invisible chains, addictions engineered, attention harvested, bloodlines weakened not by swords but by systems. Do you see it? The same principle. Break the man, own the man. Think of it this way, the eunuchs of old stood as proof that mutilation could be turned into loyalty. Today, the loyal classes are manufactured not with knives, but with ideology. Men neutered of will. Men stripped of defiance. Men remade into servants who guard palaces they'll never enter, defend rulers they'll never meet, protect systems that quietly feed upon them. The old empires did this with iron, the new empires do it with influence. But the outcome is the same. A man divided from his own strength is a man owned. Now you understand why this history was buried. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Castration was never about flesh alone, it was about removing the dangerous spark of autonomy. And today, that spark is still hunted. Only the weapons have changed. The screams of the past echo in silence today. But the wound is the same, identity mutilated in service of power. So the question is this: will you allow yourself to be remade, stripped, sterilized of defiance? Or will you remember what history tried to erase, that true power cannot be taken unless you surrender it? If you've listened this far, you are no longer the same man you were at the start. You've walked through the labyrinth of horrors, and now you stand at its center. Write it again, twice, as your seal of transformation: the blade cannot unmake me. This is not just a phrase, it is a warning to the powers that be. You've heard the forbidden history. You've seen the hidden pattern. And now you know, mutilation is not the end. Awareness is the beginning. The descent is over. The awakening begins.